orthography testing today, and I want to begin with a rallying cry. We urgently need a large number of perceptive and sensitive tests to find out to what extent the orthographies currently in use are in fact adequate, and until such testing is done, we will continue to pay an outrageously high price in readability for relatively small gains in simplicity and remain quite unaware of it. That was Sarah Gudczynski writing over half a century ago, and her words are as relevant to us today as they were then. So when we come to orthography testing, I think it's quite helpful to adopt Elke Karen's model, where she divides the world into casual, informal, and formal orthography testing. But I want to suggest that these are not closed categories. What we're really dealing with here is a continuum from the most informal test you can possibly imagine. What would that be? Wandering into a classroom and seeing what the students are doing, and the students don't even know why you're there, to the most rigorously designed experiment you can imagine with full statistical analysis, and it's been published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal. Now, because it's a continuum, the boundaries between casual and informal testing are not easy to trace. I know, Jadine, you said to me in one of your messages to me that you consider it to be informal when you bring people together for the purpose. It becomes an event. And that seems to me a valid way of dividing up the cake. But in the end, I don't think it matters too much where we trace the line between casual and informal testing. What is much more important is where we trace the line between informal and formal testing, and that's what I want, well, one of the things that I want to do in this talk. So let's have a look at informal testing first, and then we will go on to formal testing. To my mind, one of the most important things to state when we're talking about informal testing is that it is suitable for testing spelling choices that are important locally, but they don't have major consequences elsewhere. We're in the realm here then of qualitative data. We're dealing with preferences, attitudes, reactions, experiences, and observations. But there may also be room for quantitative data in an informal experiment, and this is where the line gets a bit blurred. If you have quantitative data in an informal experiment, you're really only dealing with descriptive statistics, probably reporting averages, for example, but there's no in-depth statistical analysis. And therefore, you can only make an impressionistic interpretation of the results. Now, a good example of community interaction workshop comes from Papua New Guinea, where the workshop's aim is to produce an alphabet that can be used and tested by a language group. So it's really, the whole thing is an extended process of informal testing where participants are going to be checking and editing each other's creative writing. They're led through a process of directed word lists. They are doing spelling tests. They fill in preference questionnaires. And then note-taking by the course administrator during group discussions, and all this leads to a series of trial decisions. And then those trial decisions undergo a second cycle, retesting with more exercises. Now, one of the advantages of this approach, I think, is that it trains the participants to themselves test the trial orthographies in their own speech communities when they return to their locations after the conference. And so I wonder whether this model has potential for those of you who are working in areas with restricted access. I think it's really important to avoid any suggestion of an institutional split when we come to talking about community interaction workshops, where the phonologists are saying, you know, well, we've got a tried and tested method and we know how to do it. The orthography is kind of an unscientific extension of our scientific phonological analysis. And the literacy specialists are saying, yes, but please remember that whenever there's language involved, there's human beings as well. And I think actually one thing that this conference has shown me is that we're doing well at avoiding an institutional split. Our various approaches are complementary, they are not competitive. And that means that a linguist can have a role in a community interaction workshop. For instance, by identifying likely problems in advance through their knowledge of areal, phonological, and syntactic features, and by challenging linguistically unsound proposals. Now, as I've prepared for this talk, I was getting information from all around the world. Thank you to many of you who sent me information. And here's the cumulative list of everything that I'm aware of. There's evidently more out there. But my impression is that informal testing within the SIL family of organizations is happening everywhere globally. It seems to have become a natural part of the orthography development process, and that is good news. So I don't think we need any encouragement to undertake informal testing. It's happening. Where we perhaps need more encouragement is making sure that we leave a paper trail. We always need to be doing orthography testing, whether it's informal or formal, with the next generation of orthography developers in mind, knowing that orthographies don't get developed over weeks, months, or even years. They are intergenerational. And the process spans over very often several decades. So an informal test is not going to be publishable in a journal, but it should still be written up and still be made available, these days of course online. And so my question is to you, what structures does your entity have in place for facilitating the paper trail? I think the pioneers in this were probably Papua New Guinea and Cameroon, and many entities have followed suit now. There are means for making our informal testing available to others in many locations. One tip about writing up an informal experiment: it is really important that you use the word informal in your title. You make it absolutely clear from the beginning that this is an informal test. And that is because outside of SIL circles, the term orthography testing always means formal testing. And so if a cognitive psychologist stumbles across some of our work online and it's an informal test, at the best they'll go away disappointed, at the worst they'll go away with a negative impression of what SIL is doing. So that's all I really want to say about informal testing. I want to spend most of the time in this talk talking about formal testing. And here, contrary to informal testing, I think this kind of approach is particularly suitable for testing an orthographic principle that has cross-linguistic interest, as opposed to a few spelling options that are of importance locally, but they don't have any major repercussions elsewhere. We're talking about principles here. And we're in the domain of quantitative data with a stated hypothesis, a rigorous design, numerical data that undergoes in-depth statistical analysis. And crucially as well, tests of this kind are always published. I don't consider them formal until they've been published. And what's the purpose of that? Well, it contributes to a gradual accumulation of knowledge, and that is going to make orthography development easier for future generations. So let's have a look at some examples. The first one I want to pick is what we call a within subjects design. I'm taking here the example of the Combe language in Cameroon. In this kind of experiment design, each participant is going to be exposed to each orthographic condition. So you measure the performance of each participant against themselves. And in this particular experiment in Combe, there was no training intervention, but in many within subjects designs, you will have a training intervention. Bernard and his colleagues, their aim was to confirm or reject the rather provocative hypothesis that tone diacritics only serve to complicate the reading process. They worked with 13 participants, and actually, by the way, that is not generally considered sufficient to get reliable and convincing results. You really need to be working with a minimum of 25 participants in each orthographic condition. So if you've got 2 groups, then you need 50. If you've got 3 groups, you need 75 minimum. The task was oral reading of lists of sentences with and without tone marks, and they scored perception time, vocalization time, and accuracy. And then when they put all those data into a statistical analysis, they found a very clear context effect, whereby as sentence length increases, so does accuracy. They also found a familiarity effect, where participants read proverbs faster and more accurately than any other kinds of sentences. And they found a negative effect for full tone marking, where full tone marking produced slower and less accurate reading in this one language. So now let's go on to a between groups design. I'll take here Seth Vetrano-Wilson's experiment in Hmong Dao on word breaks. Is Seth here this morning? He can correct me. Hi, Seth. Correct me if I get it wrong. So the research question, is there a significant difference in silent reading speed and comprehension between word-spaced versus syllable-spaced spelling in Hmong Romanized alphabet? Seth worked with a maximum of 47 participants, depending on which exercise it was, proficient and frequent readers of Hmong Dao in both the USA and Thailand, and all the participants were familiar with both word spacing and syllable spacing. You divided them into parallel groups, and each group was exposed to only one orthographic condition, and he measured group A against group B. And again, in this test, there's no training intervention, but in many between groups designs, you would test people, train them in something new, and then have a test at the end. That's not the case here. The stimuli were texts, sentences, and lists of disyllabic words. And there's an impressive list of 45 demographic, item-related, performance-related variables. These are the elements within the test that are predicted to impact performance. And Seth found that syllable spacing offers a speed advantage for sentences containing previously unencountered disyllabic words and those same disyllabic words in isolation. Now, a third approach, which I've developed myself for use in Kabylie and also in the Eastern Dan language of Ivory Coast, is what I'm terming error peak analysis. Yoruba as well, done some work with Matthew Harley on that. And this is what it looks like. This is a text extract. They decided to take the bag and go and steal. And you'll see that there's an error peak there. It's a concentration of errors by numerous participants in one place. So the x-axis is the text extract split into syllables. The y-axis is the average number of tonal errors per participant. The dotted line is 29 readers reading a zero-tone text. The full line is 28 readers reading a full-tone text. Now here, although we're dealing with numerical data, it's really we're only using numerical data to draw our attention to the most important places where there's really problems. But after that, it's a qualitative approach where the linguist, you have to have an in-depth knowledge of the language, which I didn't, but my co-author did, Valentin Vidrin. He's able to make linguistic judgments of the likely causes of why those errors happened. And in this case, it's perfectly obvious. The word for bag is judged to have attracted more errors because it's a different lexeme in one of the other dialects. So just because you have an error peak, it doesn't mean that it's because of tone. So I want now to have a look at the subdomain of literature on tone orthography testing. Two reasons for that. One is that it's what I know best, but also as I look around this room, many of us are dealing with tone issues, so it seems particularly relevant. We'll start with Africa, and this is a graph across time of all the tone orthography literature. And you can see it's very patchy. Whole years, sequences of years go by with nothing happening at all. From the very earliest test, which was Essien, working on the Efik language of Nigeria, about half a century ago now. He was the pioneer. To the most recent, which is our book published in 2021, which is a report of 10 Niger-Congo languages, and we did the same experiment in all 10 of them. And then this date seems particularly important to highlight. This is Bernard and his team. I already talked about the comb experiment, but he did a preceding comb experiment with just one participant. So it's not very convincing research, but it's a great research design. And the crucial thing is it was the first experiment in our domain that ever used a statistical methodology. And really, he set a new standard. What it means is that actually everything preceding that can't really, by today's standards, be regarded as formal tests at all. And if they were submitted to a journal these days, they wouldn't get published. That's not to denigrate them. There's some really good stuff, and I really recommend, for example, Joseph Mfonyam's PhD thesis on Bafut and Limbum, because what it lacks in statistical methodology, he makes up for in his understanding of issues of orthographic depth. And the other date I want to highlight is an article I wrote in 2008. It's actually the literature review from my PhD thesis, where I just did a survey of everything that had preceded 30 years of tone orthography testing. And in that article, I claimed that West Africa is the crucible for orthography testing worldwide, that nothing else was happening anywhere else. What I didn't know at that time was that there was a new and emerging strand of tone orthography experimentation literature coming out of Asia. So let's compare Africa and Asia now. This is the same graph with the Asian experiments superimposed. And you see what happens. These new Asian experiments rising like Asian skyscrapers out of the dust. And, you know, it's quite difficult to keep pace with this literature now. There's about, on average, 4 new papers coming out a year. And it's completely changed the domain. So from about the year 2000 onwards, a real flourishing of Asian literature. But the literature from Africa and from Asia, quite different from each other. Let's have a look and compare them. So first of all, almost all the experiments coming from Africa are done by linguists, whereas those coming out of Asia are generally done by cognitive psychologists, psycholinguists, and in 1 or 2 cases, neurolinguists. Almost all the African experiments are single-authored, whereas those coming out of Asia are teams of researchers co-authoring. Almost all the African experiments, with the exception of Yoruba, are minority languages. We can't call Yoruba a minority language with 32 million people. And as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, the ones coming out of Asia are always focusing on majority languages, specifically Mandarin, Cantonese, and Thai. Those coming from Africa are concerned with orthography development for the most part, and they are dealing with issues therefore to do with orthographic depth, tonal diacritic density, grammatical tone, whereas those in Asia are generally concerned with issues of child language acquisition, second language learner language acquisition, perception, cognition, memory, and learning disabilities such as dyslexia and dysgraphia. That does not mean that we can't learn from them as orthography developers. And it has to be said that the repertoire of African experiments is variable in quality, whereas almost everything that is emerging from Asia is of a very superior quality. So let's have a look at some of these Asian experiments. I want to begin with pinyin. That's the official Chinese Roman script orthography used in China, Singapore, and, as I understand it, to a lesser extent in Taiwan. And it's used to teach L1 and L2 students how to pronounce Chinese words and characters. And it's worthy of our attention if only because it's by far the world's most widely used tone orthography and its most successful. How do we know it's successful? Because of experimentation. Grade 1 formal instruction in pinyin dramatically improves tone awareness. Knowledge of pinyin predicts reading success after grade 1. Now, Huff and Payne investigated interpretation of monosyllabic homophones and tonal minimal pairs in pinyin when it is stripped of tone marks. They worked with 22 L1 Mandarin speakers, and the task was on a computer screen to select one of 2 Chinese characters corresponding to a toneless pinyin stimulus. And they've identified in the results a strong role for high lexical frequency and little evidence of the tones themselves affecting the pattern of responses. Now, this is interesting because for those of us in Africa, this is the same methodology that has been used in Com, in Chang, and in the 10 Niger-Congo languages that we wrote about in our book. Same methodology, 2 consonants. Let's start to join the dots up here. It's also interesting for me because in my work on Cabier, Steve Walter and I did a test testing the representation of grammatical tone in Cabier, divided the participants up into 2 groups. One learned a grammatical meaning-based approach. One learned the tone diacritic approach, sound-based. And we found that in the grammatical group, there was a strong contribution of frequency of the grammatical constructions that was entirely absent in the tone group. So frequency effects occurring in Kabye and in Mandarin. Let's start to join the dots. Li and colleagues tested the production and perception of Mandarin tones with this time 16 L2 Cantonese learners. And they compared oral reading errors between stimuli written in pinyin and Chinese characters. And they found that, yes, indeed, pinyin facilitates correct tone production, but participants are not necessarily aware of the meanings. Now, this is interesting because Matthew and I found the same thing in Yoruba, that Yoruba students, amongst all the 10 languages we tested, have the fastest reading speed and they're quite accurate when they read, but they don't necessarily know what they're reading. It doesn't transform into comprehension. And that made us question whether the Nigerian education system favors literacy performance over knowledge acquisition. Now, we've looked then at tone orthography experiments, but the Asian literature goes way beyond just tone issues. I want to give you a very brief survey. Indic scripts, for those of you who are working in scripts that are alpha syllabaries, be aware of this literature. I'm only giving one citation for each one, but there's a whole body of literature out there on literacy in alpha syllabic scripts. Kannada, Marathi, Sinhala. The Cyrillic script, Russian, then coming back into Europe, Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian. And the Arabic script is particularly prolific in the Arabic language itself. I've got a list of about 60 or 70 tests done on Arabic language. But of course, the Arabic language has then been borrowed by so many other languages, and there are experiments on its use in Farsi, Urdu, Malay, Kashmiri. And then coming back to Africa, where we're dealing mostly with the Roman script, with the exception of Ethiopia and the Nko script in Guinea, these tests are generally not done by linguists or cognitive psychologists. These are education specialists working in Kenya, Mali, South Africa, Uganda. So a lot of interesting research emerging from these countries that aren't particularly to do with orthography development, but we can still glean a lot from them. Now, we're talking here then about crossing over from our own comfortable disciplines to something else. And it's a challenge. I think that most of us here are either linguists or literacy specialists. We really need to get to grips with this literature from the psychology of reading and those producing experiments who are education specialists. Now, it's not easy. The art is in accepting that you're not going to understand everything. How could you? Because you haven't been trained as a cognitive psychologist. It's okay. You'll glean something. You won't get everything when you read these papers. But extracting what can be learned from an unfamiliar discipline and trying to see where the overlapping interests are between us as linguists and literacy specialists and cognitive psychologists. And then being alert to opportunities for cross-disciplinary collaboration. And this is the most ideal place for that to happen is at international conferences where we rub shoulders with these people. And by the way, they love us because we're working on exotic, minority, endangered languages. They want to collaborate with us. So why would you need to collaborate? Well, my background is as a linguist. I never wanted to train as a statistician. I mean, why Why would you retrain when you've already got your work cut out as a linguist? I entered into collaboration mainly with Steve Walter, with a few other people as well. They do the statistics. I know just about enough about statistics to make intelligent comments about it. They know just about enough about my linguistics to make intelligent comments about the situation in West Africa. And somehow we managed to have a dialogue and produce something. But also, it's really good to collaborate with a cognitive psychologist, because these people, orthography testing is their bread and butter. That's what they do with their lives. And I would never try to run a test without running the design by a cognitive psychologist before I do it. So let's think now about what the priorities are for formal testing. This is only my own bucket list, and there's a whole load of other stuff, but anyway, I'll share it with you. First of all, orthographic depth. When we think in SIL world about orthographic depth, I think what comes straight to mind for many of us is Keith Snyder's lexical orthography hypothesis, which says that representing the output of the lexical phonology is the optimal depth for an orthography. So far, it has only been subject to one experiment in Cabiet, and only for writers, not for readers. We really need to multiply tests on this, testing this hypothesis. But I also want to suggest that, we have in mind generally an idea of a continuum of orthographic depth from shallow to deep, and I don't think this is sufficient. We need to be laying out orthographic depth on three continuums of completeness, simplicity, and regularity. For an example, the Shona orthography in southern Africa does not mark tone. Therefore, it is relatively incomplete and deep on that scale. But everything that is represented, consonants and vowels, is relatively simple and regular. So we can term it a deep, shallow, shallow orthography. The French orthography doesn't have tone to think about, neither does it have phonemic stress. So everything is represented, it's complete. The rules are horrendously complex until the day when, as a language learner, you realize that in spite of their complexity, they're also highly regular. So we can term French a shallow, deep, shallow orthography. And we need then experiments that tease out these 8 possible configurations and separate out orthography depth on the parameters of completeness, simplicity, and regularity. Tone. This is of interest to many of us, and for my money, the most important research question we can ask at the stage we're at is, do tonal disfluencies decrease with regular, extensive practice? I think this is so important because in almost all the contexts we're living in and working in, people aren't getting nearly enough exposure and practice to the written form of the language to become truly proficient. And therefore, any experiment we're doing, we're dealing with muddied waters. And until we have an answer to this question, I think we have to take all the other experimental evidence that we're getting with a pinch of salt. Do meaning-based representations of grammatical tone contribute to fluency and comprehension more than sound-based representations? Again, worldwide, we only have one experiment that sheds light on this research question, and it's only dealing with writing, not with reading. If a closed set of lexical tonal minimal pairs is to be marked, which is what Mary Pierce suggested for Kara in Chad, what's the numerical threshold beyond which learners are going to struggle to memorize the list? It will be such a simple test to do, but nobody's doing it. And then just geographically speaking, we're still waiting on any contributions from Latin America, Inga. I think Mexico's on the map there, isn't it? Anyway, more priorities for formal testing. Script choice. In this part of the world, this is one of the most important things you're dealing with most of the time. So if you're working in a language which uses 2 or more scripts, so Kashmiri using Sharada, Devanagari, Perso-Arabic scripts, or if you're working in a country where 2 or more scripts are kind of jostling for space, which is the case in Ethiopia with the Ge'ez, Abugida, and the Roman script alphabet, with some languages like Konso shifting from one to the other. Or if you're working in a context where one type of writing system is being adapted for another purpose. So Pashto, for example, takes the Arabic abjad and recycles it as an alphabet. Yiddish takes the Hebrew abjad and recycles it as an alphabet. If you're working in any of these contexts, then this is ripe for experimentation, and any contribution you can make will make a good contribution to the literature, as long as you do it well. So just to complete then, I want to give you a friendly nudge in the direction of moving from informal testing, which so many of us are doing, towards formal testing. And that means that we'll be moving from testing individual spelling options to testing orthographic principles. And we'll be taking momentarily the focus off the local language community of our own assignment to a research project that has potential for having cross-linguistic impact. We're moving then from single disciplinary research to a team-based approach of cross-disciplinary research. We're moving from single-authored research to co-authored research. And hopefully then from unpublished manuscripts to published articles. And there I rest my case. Thank you for listening. We have about 40 minutes. Is that enough time for folks who want to take some time now for questions? We can take time.